wonderful to see everybody here. We're now moving on to the President's address for the evening, which is the memory of Sir Walter Scott. And I'm very glad to say that we have our President, outgoing President here this evening, Sir Tom Devine, to deliver that. Before I introduce Sir Tom, I just want to say that as a patron of the National Library and a member of the National Trust, I would like to recommend everybody here who has an interest in Scott to look at supporting the Huddersfield appeal, which the Huddersfield collection has not been visible for a century, and now a large consortium of UK institutions, including the National Library and National Trust for Scotland, are seeking to write for the nation. It includes the entire working manuscript of Scott's Red Gauntlet and a significant amount of other Scott material, as well as, of course, Barnes's Commonplace book and a whole range of other Scottish manuscripts, all of which, if this appeal is successful, it's come very close to being successful, will be in the National Library of Scotland. I think there are some literature and brochures in the corner, around the corner there, should you be interested in the Huddersfield appeal, which I, of course, myself intend to support. But beyond that, which is not a sales pitch, as I will get nothing from it, we're very glad to introduce Professor Sir Tom Devine, who is, quite frankly, an extraordinary historian. I'm not sure that Tom always knows how good a historian I think he is, but I think he is absolutely exceptional. And one of the things that I think that is exceptional about him is the way that he has moved through so many of the major questions of Scottish history and has perhaps definitively answered some of them. For example, the book on the Scottish clearances, inclusive, powerful, determined, comprehensive and correct, which was published in 2018 by Alan Lane in the Penguin edition in 2019, is an absolutely extraordinary tour de force of integrating an understanding of land use and the exile from land use in Scotland, and in separating the bad enough and difficult enough to accept facts of the matter from some of the mythology that grew around them, particularly in the immediate run-up to the Napier Commission in 1884 and the publication of Skene's Celtic Scotland. So, to describe Sir Tom's achievements would take the time that is allotted for him to speak, so I'm not going to do that. I'm simply going to say that it's very rare to hear a Scottish historian of such distinction, such fluency, such power, such conviction, and so in command of the data and archival realities of history as Sir Tom Devine. And I'm very pleased to ask him to come and deliver to us the memory of Sir Walter Scott. Tom Devine.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honour for me because I'm by no means a literary eminence or even a literary scholar. I am a mere historian, and I've been asked to say words about one of the great figures of Scottish literature and indeed world literature tonight. I want to begin by thanking Professor Pittock for those extremely generous remarks. And my only concern, of course, is that they may create within you expectations that I cannot deliver and may not deliver after that wonderful feast. But I have been studiously trying to avoid the wine. That will be for later. One person passing by said, "I'm really looking forward to the jokes." I said, I thought this was supposed to be a lugubrious presentation in memory of this great man. The other thing is, if you turn to my biography on the other side of your menu, none of that is accurate, except for the last sentence, where I am described as the rock star of Caledonian historians. This statement created the most extraordinary myth among my children, grandchildren, and wife, but it just happens to be true. So Walter Scott, ladies and gentlemen, when he died in 1832, was the most famous and most popular, best read prose writer, novelist in the world. His accolades internationally are numerous. One scholar, literary scholar, identified the fact that to be alive and also to be literate in the 19th century meant one had some knowledge of the Waverley novels. And if you look at European culture during the 19th century, well outside prose writing and poetry and other arts of that type, and move into opera and music and theatre, the echoes of Scott and his writings are everywhere in Western and Central and Eastern Europe, and also in North America. It is difficult to think of any other Scotsman or woman in the last several centuries who has presented such an indelible picture and an evocative picture of their country, of their nation, as he has done. And that set of structures, imaginative structures, that he presented to the world has been long-lasting and endured right down to the present day. There are no less than 3,000 references to non-English works about Scott and translations of Scott in the database of the National Library of Scotland. And that says all about his vast international appeal. But what I want to do tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is to withdraw from the national arena, because his mark there is so well known, especially to this audience, and consider his impact and influence in Old Scotia, his impact and influence on his own country. Because, and I will write, as I am doing for a newspaper about this text that I'm going to give you, I will comment about this as an historian. So the emphasis of what I have to say is based upon my trade. I do not intend to expand in great detail about the quality of his literary works as the fons origine of the historical novel, of the extraordinary popularity, as I've already indicated, of his prose writings, of his mastery as a poet, as a folklorist, as antiquarian, and also, of course, not least, as an historian. But what I want to do is to reflect upon the influence he had on the politics, mentality, and culture of his own country at a time which may not be known to many of you, a time of great crisis in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a great crisis of identity, a great crisis of concern about the future of Scottish nationhood in that period. To do that, before I come back to Scott, I've got to sketch the context, the historical context. And I want to begin far from Scotland, in Paris. In 1882, a very distinguished French historian gave what to me is the most seminal presentation ever given on nationality and nationhood. In his presentation, he argued that the beliefs of his time, that a nation was based on language, ethnicity, and race, plus geography, that notion was erroneous. Instead, the community of a nation was based almost entirely on sentiment, on spirit and soul. And what he meant by that was a nation became a nation and endured as a nation because of the anchors, intellectual or imaginative, back into the history of the community. That a nation was based on memory, facts either real, that could even be mythical, facts real or mythical, about how the nation had come to be and how it would endure. This insight by Ernest Renan at the Sorbonne in 1882 are not only powerful, they're not only potent, but they're very relevant to what I want to say about the significance of Sir Walter Scott in the historical development of Scotland. Because, as I've already indicated in terms of, if you like, the preliminary to this analysis that I want to carry out, there was in the period from about the late 18th century up until the 1820s, 1830s, a profound confidence, a profound crisis of confidence in the continuation of a strong sense of Scottish identity and even of a strong sense of nationhood itself. The ancient nation of Scotland, one of the most enduring and earliest in Europe, at a time when Europe was full of princedoms, duchies, papal kingdoms, and the like. This nation existed in the early medieval period. But who would have thought that in the early 19th century, its leading intellectuals, or at least some of them, thought that this particular historical inheritance of glory and past and a distinctive national identity, many of them thought that it would not survive. Scott himself noted in his one of his remarks, "What makes Scotland Scotland is fast disappearing." Lord Cockburn, one of the greatest legal minds of his age, "This is truly the last Scotch age. This is truly the last Scotch age." William Robertson, the principal of the University of Edinburgh, moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, perhaps because of his strong unionist credentials, in the 1750s has said, "The union will make us one people." Prediction being that the distinctive entities of Scotland and England might disappear in a compressed new nation. But at the same time, of course, it was self-evident to many that the superior influence in this new particular development would be England. The Scotland, of course, in terms of the cliché, was in bed with an elephant. So this fear by Sir Walter and others was based in two primary historical foundations, and very quickly I'll give you those before I then go to see how far Sir Walter Scott's life and work feed into this particular imbroglio. The first, of course, was the Union. By the later 18th, early 19th century, the Union was successful in economic terms, massively so. Penetration of empire, the great leap forward that was going on in parts of the central lowlands economically. But of course, the primary thing that was going on in the later 18th century was the long wars with Catholic France. They weren't simply wars about Europe. Eventually, they were wars, when we reached the Napoleonic period, for a titanic contest for the leadership of the world, and of course, for the control over those amazing sources of riches in North America, the West Indies, and India. And because of that, the fusion between England and Scotland became potent. Became potent because the best effect, the most important influence on a new patriotism of Britishness was to face a common enemy. A common enemy not simply for one war, 7 Years' War, the American War, the Revolutionary Wars, and then the Napoleonic Wars, all between 1763 to 1815. It was not surprising that people thought that Scotland, because of this new fusion of identity with Britishness, might disappear, might vanish simply as a regional appendage to England as North Britain. Time and time again in my own research, I've come across the reference to Scotland by the 1790s, early 1800s, as North Britain. The second factor, the second influence, which threatened identity and nationhood, was as Scott himself put it in that remarkable preface or preamble to Waverley in 1814. There is not a single nation in Europe which has undergone such a complete change in the last 50 years or so as this Kingdom of Scotland. It has rendered a class of beings, who are as different from their grandfathers as the current English as are from those of the days of Queen Elizabeth in the 16th centuries. In that particular way, Scott captured the extraordinary squeezed and rapid nature of Scottish transformation in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. Not until forced Soviet industrialization in the 1930s did any single country experience the root and branch change, almost the deracinated change that occurred in Scotland. Very briefly, there were at least 3 or 4 different forms of revolution. Industrialization, the fastest in Europe, making Scotland in the early 19th century the second richest nation on the planet. Urbanization, from one Scot, 10%, 15% of Scots living in urban surroundings, to well over a third by as early as the 1820s. The thing that Murray referred to in my last work, the work on the huge changes in rural society, Highland society moving from tribalism to capitalism over 2 generations, rural lowland society where virtually everybody eked out at least a portion on the land. By the 1810s, 1820s, the vast majority of the people who lived in lowland Scotland were landless, either tradesmen, farm servants, or maybe moving off the land into the new growing towns. And not least, of course, the fact that for the first time in Scottish history, the old volatility in population came to an end. The ups and downs of hitting against the food barrier came to an end. Instead, there was sustained growth in population. The extent of the revolution is still underappreciated by modern Scots today. It was foundational, and because of that, to go back to my primary thesis, because of that, the connections with the past, the sheet anchors back into history, imaginative sheet anchors, emotional, partly mythical, but also partly based on real history, were in danger of foundering, were in danger of being lost. And that is what the intellectuals I referred to earlier were concerned about. They did not know what was going to happen. They thought there was a grave crisis. And this is where Sir Walter Scott is so important. I stress, because of the limited time available to me, that he was not the only factor in the response to this, but he was a hugely important, if not fundamental, influence through his writings in the response which helped to heal this potential division between the Scottish present of the late 18th, early 19th centuries and the Scottish past. Those twin forces of Britishness, one might even say Anglicisation, and the huge changes in material structures. One of the reasons why they were confronted and the crisis did not emerge was because of Scott. It's my view, ladies and gentlemen, that Sir Walter Scott was more important in the validation and the dissemination of the sense of the 19th century's sense of the Scottish historical past than all the Scottish universities combined. Let's not forget that in the 18th century, the literati of the Scottish Enlightenment, with their heavy intellectual artillery, gave some of the mythologies of the Scottish past a serious pounding, demonstrating the mythology of the long list of Scottish kings, demonstrating that many of the things believed about the origins of the Scottish nation were based on nothing but fanciful thinking and so on. There was no interest in specific Scottish history in much of the Scottish universities right through until the end of the 19th century. So the Scots obtained their awareness of Scotland's past from the pen of Sir Walter Scott, although he would never ever have considered himself a professional historian. Tales of a grandfather were very important also for children. He gave the Highlands in particular a new magical appeal as the Scottish past living into the Scottish present. The Scottish past living into the Scottish present. And by so doing, of course, helped to give the Highlands this remarkable psychological appeal, not simply in his homeland, but abroad as well. So that linkage back to what Reynolds said was essential to the well-being and continuation of a nation, as he also argued, nations are not eternal. They obviously begin, but they can also end. That sense, the soldering of what was in danger of becoming apart, was one of the benefits that this man gave. One of the impacts he made on the development of this country, leaving aside his particular historical, leaving aside his particular literary skills for one moment, which are well known. And then the second and last thing I want to mention is the fascinating story of Scottish hybridity. That is the dual identity. So we have the intellect, some of the intellectocracy of Scotland fearing that Britishness will create an appendage north of the former border rather than a continued nation, on the one hand. But then on the other hand, you have the influence of myth, you have the influence of some memory of what had gone before. And as far as this lecture is concerned, or these remarks are concerned, the impact of Scott's writings relating back to the old world and giving a special prominence in that set of recollections to Highland society. The kilt and tartan, formerly known as the badge of savagery, the reconciliation between Hanoverian rural society, Hanoverian lowland society, and at least partially Jacobite Highland society came about in part because of what Scott was doing in terms of the Waverley novels and the effect that they had in terms of a new awareness of the way in which faithless and recalcitrant Jacobites were turned eventually into national heroes. He was able to do it partly because the Highland regiments, who were regimented in kilts, who were demonstrably of Highland origin, were also imperial warriors. If you look at traditional Highland costume today, even, well, in quote mark traditional Highland costume today, even in this room, you will see that they are part, and obviously partly and emphatically Scottish, but they're also the remnants of the uniform of an imperial warrior. And so that kind of hybridity, that kind of interrelationship between Scottishness and Britishness was a kind of cultural nationalism which in his work Scott propagated. And of course you could argue that Highland dress is a form of sartorial nationalism. Sartorial nationalism. It's not in any sense a political threat. Because to be a political threat to the Union in the early 19th century was a false trail. Scotland was emphatically and completely and unambiguously and uncritically Unionist. The trick was to find a way of identifying something that was distinctively Scottish but would not be offensive in a political way. So that link between his development of Highlandism, not least in 1822 with the King's visit and him dressed in Stuart tartan, that relationship, together with the novels with a Highland presence, were fundamental to this emotional, and it is emotional awareness, emotional sense that there was still something different. As one scholar has pointed out, the more Lowland Scotland became like England, the more it turned to Highland society as a mode of cultural, and I would argue, of course, sartorial differentiation. So what I want to say in the last couple of minutes is this. I think to a large extent, the man we are honouring tonight, Sir Walter, I don't know if you can hear me, but I'll stand beside him. The man we are honouring tonight is known for his literary works. In my view, he also should be known for the indelible mark, right down to the present day, that he left on the history of his country between the late 18th century and the late 18th century and now. And that is why now, in the year 2021, whatever one's political sense or political partiality, they can raise a glass to Scott, because at a critical time in the emergence and development of this ancient country, his role, if not the only factor, was certainly a very striking aspect of the escape from regionalism and loss of identity, and certainly loss of nationhood in that late 18th, early 19th century period. Ladies and gentlemen, you're better off than me because I don't have a glass. If anybody could give me one, perhaps one especially filled with wine. I want you, please, if you would. Thank you. Thank you, Ian. I want you, please, if you would, to stand. Raise your glass, or glasses if you have two, and drink a toast to the memory of Sir Walter Scott in his 250th birthday year. Sir Walter Scott.
Sir Walter Scott.
Thank you.
Thank you indeed very much, Sir Tom. And it now falls to me to toast. Am I okay here on there, or do you want me up there? It now falls to me to toast. There are two toasts down there, the City Leg and the New Club, and I contended they'll be amalgamated into a single toast. But what we're toasting tonight is a city which is both historic and dynamic. If we consider what we've just heard, the pivotal role of Scott, Scott, who was an honorary member of this club, though I understand he didn't actually turn up, stands between the Enlightenment and the Victorian achievements of Edinburgh. And I think sometimes the Victorian achievements of Edinburgh are understated. So if we look at what constituted Edinburgh, not only as a historic but a dynamic city, we're looking at a city which actually fulfills the criteria which we associate today with a modern smart city. That is, Enlightenment Edinburgh is a city of very closely linked and mixed use between residential and commercial. It's a city with a significant diversity factor in the sense both of foreign residents and those who receive substantial education abroad. It's a city with a very high concentration of professionals and a very strongly educated group of people. And the success of Enlightenment Edinburgh could actually be predicated on modern smart city theory. But a significant part of that success came not from isolation, and that I think we've all had rather too much of. Well, I have anyway. I'm sure that's echoed around the room. But association. And it's in association that we want particularly to remember this club, founded in 1787, only 33 years after the foundation of the Select Society, a critical production of late Enlightenment Edinburgh, which benefited from one of the great achievers of Victorian Edinburgh, William Burns' design of 1837, which moved the club to its current location. Burn himself was born in Rose Street, so not exactly very far away, as everyone will be aware, but he is also the, if not the absolute founder, at least the substantial author of the Scots baronial style, both in Scotland and Australia, where some of the initial commissions were made. In fact, Ballarat and elsewhere have some of the first Scots baronial buildings in the world. And that Burns' representation of Scots baronial, which is an invented tribute architectural style, which came to characterize so much of Scotland, from developments like the National Portrait Gallery here to 50 Queen's Road in Aberdeen, and to indeed the buildings of which could be found in West Central Scotland too. That was a tribute to Sir Walter Scott and Scott's reconceptualization of the importance of the Scottish past as present in the Scottish present. So the city of Edinburgh was a dynamic city and an extraordinary city in the 18th century. It remained so in the 19th century. The new club splendidly bridges those two. It bridges Enlightenment Edinburgh and Victorian Edinburgh. And in the achievement of the Enlightenment and its legacy, and in the design of the modern new club by William Byrne, and Burns' legacy, which you still see all around us, in the presentation of Scotland as both historic and contemporary, we see a place, a city, and a club that should be honoured. A place. Look, if that's William Byrne on the line telling me what happening, tell me. We see a city and a place which encapsulate the values of the Enlightenment, the dynamism of modernity, and the historic representation of a historic nation which maintains in its historic realization a contemporaneity which the Victorians celebrated and which we still have not lost, all under the guise of association. Let us, particularly at the end of the 18 months we've just had, celebrate this city and this association, the City of Edinburgh and the new club. I give you the toast. The City of Edinburgh and the new club.
City of Edinburgh.
A slight change from the published programme. I'm now pleased to ask Professor Peter Garside to respond to the toast and give the vote of thanks. Peter.
Well, I hope you don't mind me standing here. You can see me, I can see you, and I've got to like microphones. Although when I was working as a university teacher, I never had a microphone ever. I used to bawl into huge halls. But they're wonderful, so here I am, enjoying it. Thank you, Murray, for your excellent hosting of this dinner. When chairing such meetings myself some time back, I recall always at the onset remarking that the annual dinner represented the jewel in the crown of the club's activities. Now, this came from an inherited script. I don't know quite how old it was. It felt a bit old as you read it, and I must admit, not at first at least, enunciating the words with entire conviction. I thought I was not the sort of guy for such formalities when I started. Since then, though, I've been able to understand things better, I hope, and to appreciate the connection that this event allows with the person we've been celebrating this evening. Scott himself attended innumerable Edinburgh Society dinners as an office holder, a speaker, a composer of songs marking the occasion. Mostly he did so enthusiastically, conscious of the centrality of such events in the fabric of civic society. Scott thrived at a time of extraordinary vigour in the life of Edinburgh. I always think of Scott finishing off Waverley, the larger part of Waverley in Castle Street, early in the summer of 1814, at a time when the Allies were closing in on Napoleon, and it looked like a war of effectively 20 years was coming to an end. It went on for another year, of course, but it was a time of great energy, I think, in the life of Edinburgh and of Scotland. And perhaps it's not all that too vain to think of our own emergent selves now as in a potentially comparable situation. Certainly the Scott 250 events have gone off remarkably well, notwithstanding lockdown, with the club providing a sequence of excellent online meetings and even a virtual supper earlier this year. But how amazing it is to see people not virtually, but it seems almost uncanny to see faces again. But it's a wonderful moment, I think, and quite uplifting. There's nothing to beat the real thing. And Tom Devine this evening has reinvigorated us all with a splendid and masterly address, outlining in vivid terms the essential place that Scott holds in national culture and in the idea of nationhood and why he still matters. Unfortunately, Judith McClure was unable to be with us to propose the toast to the new club, and Murray has effectively done that in a most interesting way, so I'm not going to go over all that ground again. But I think it's worth remarking how much, once again, we are indebted to the members and staff of the new club in providing such a remarkable and welcoming venue for these events. And it is indeed a remarkable room, and wonderful to be back in this room with these very intriguing oil paintings around us. In conclusion then, on behalf of the club, I would like once more to offer thanks to two outstanding presidents, Professor Pittock for nobly standing in as chair, minus that hand-me-down script, I might add, and Professor Devine as an exceptionally well-qualified proposer of the main toast. Also to express gratitude for the more silent input of the office bearers of the club, notably Lee Simpson and Mikey Wood. Who, between them, have worked tirelessly to keep things afloat through the pandemic storm. And lastly, but by no means least, to compliment Sir Ian Torrance, our current chairperson, for his unshowily wise governance of our day-to-day activities. So thank you for everything.